Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's another landscape in colored pencil, but this time we have a swan as a foreground interest. I use Faber Castell Polychromos colored pencils on 1000 grit sanded paper, and I'm going to show you how I did it. Let's start. So it's going to be a river scene, a riverscape if you will, and as usual we start with a composition which requires a bit of sketching, but for now I'm just going to divide the paper into two parts of roughly the same size, and I also need to decide where to put the riverbank and the trees, because I'm going to have some trees in the middle and to the right. Now another thing that I also decided to do was to sketch out the outline of the swan, because I want to know exactly where it will be, because I want to be able to work around it. I want some parts of it to be very bright, and that's why I want to avoid putting down other colors. After that I started working on the sky, and I started by laying down a bit of white pencil first. I'm going to work on top of that with a light blue pencil later. But first I put down a bit of lighter color because I want to create a gradient where the sky is a bit darker at the top and getting a bit lighter with maybe a few clouds near the horizon. So I did a little bit of blending with my Tortillions, and then I switched to a light blue pencil. The pencil I'm going to use for the most part for the sky is a light phthalo blue, and as I've already explained, at the bottom I want the sky to be a bit lighter, and I'm also maybe going to add some lighter clouds there as well. But here at the top it's going to have to be a bit darker. Now this sanded surface grinds on the pencil, so you'll get more vibrant colors immediately, but it's a little bit more difficult to cover larger areas than it is with pastel pencils, so you need to be a bit more patient when coloring in these larger areas, and you can't rely on your blending tools, because if you use them too much you will reveal a bit too much of the background color, which in my case is gray, and that's not really what I want. Now here on the horizon I'm going to have some hills or mountains in the distance, just beyond that water, beyond the river. And I used a slightly darker middle phthalo blue and a bit of sky blue for that. I did some blending and then added some more white above those hills, just to create some suggestions of clouds. So now I have that gradient that I wanted, and I'm also going to add a touch of middle phthalo blue here at the top, just to make the sky a bit darker there at the top. If you're patient while doing this, you will create a nice looking sky without much texture or lines, but you can't use too much pressure, and you have to try to cover everything thoroughly, and you have to keep your pencil fairly sharp most of the time. But the key is to be patient, because you have to understand that colored pencils are a little bit slower to work with than pastel pencils, even though on this surface they do perform much better than on regular paper. So now I'm starting to draw the riverbank, or rather some of the shadow areas of the riverbank, and maybe putting down some indications of rocks and things like that. I'm doing this with a black colored pencil, and later I'm going to add some other tones to it. But for now I just wanted to lay down some of the shadow areas and the general shape of the riverbank. After that I started drawing some trees here, and I did a lot of tutorials on how to draw trees both in colored pencil and other types of pencils. And what I normally do is I try to use these small marks to imitate the appearance of a canopy of a tree or foliage on a tree as seen from a distance. And you want to have a lot of these small shapes which are not necessarily always connected to one another, because when you look at the tree from a distance you will see these darker clusters of leaves, and they are connected with very thin small branches and twigs, and you can't really see those at a distance. That's why the shape of the tree looks more or less like this. Of course, I'm going to try to vary the shape of the trees a little bit, because the more variety the better. But my approach will be similar. My approach to drawing foliage will be similar. I'm going to combine the black colored pencil with some greens, some lighter green and some middle greens, but I'll get to that later. Right now I'm just laying down those shadow areas and working my way towards this right side of the riverbank, where I'm going to have some slightly taller trees. These are not just taller because they are slightly larger, but also because they're a little bit closer to our viewpoint. And here, to draw some of these lighter shapes or lighter areas, I'm going to use a light green. That's what I'm going to start with, and then I'm going to add some shadow areas using a black colored pencil, and I'm also going to use a black colored pencil on top of those green areas, allow them to mix a little bit and allow my black colored pencil to create some random texture. Here on the left side I started working on the water and added a bit more of the middle phthalo blue, which is darker than the color that I used for the sky. So overall the surface of the water will be just a little bit darker than the sky. And here near the horizon, or near the line of the water rather, I used Prussian blue, which is even darker. So that part of the water is going to be darker. And I want to create some smaller ripples. And the thing is that to suggest the movement of the water. And the thing is that because those which are further away are supposed to be much smaller, like very short marks, and the ones which are closer to us are going to be getting larger and wider. Now I'm back to working on these, on the foliage and on the trees. So you can see I like to skip from one part of the scene to another. Normally I tend to work from left to right and from top to bottom because I'm right-handed, but I don't necessarily stick to that specific order. Sometimes I like to skip from one part of the scene to another just to keep myself motivated and interested. Anyway, how I approach drawing the foliage here is I try to create those small shadow areas using a black colored pencil, and then to finish it off I put some lighter marks using a lighter pencil, in this case a light green pencil. And the reason why I'm able to do this here is because this sanded surface of course allows me to layer and to draw from dark to light, which I wouldn't be able to do on regular paper. So this paper has many advantages, and I always recommend working on sanded paper when you're using colored pencils or pastel pencils. Now the paper I'm using, like I said, is 1000 grit sandpaper. It's a wet to dry sandpaper that you can buy in any hardware store. But you can, if you can find or if you can afford an artist quality sanded paper, maybe that'll be even better. But this works just as well. And the size is a little bit smaller here. The size is about 5 times 9 inches. I like drawing these miniatures. I'm just putting in some lighter marks with light blue pencil in between those leaves and branches, just to make it look like the sky is coming through the canopy, canopies, because I don't want to have these canopies obscuring all of the background. So I want to punch some holes into them to make them look a bit more complex and a bit more realistic, obviously, and I want to show some branches in there and things like that. And another thing that I'm doing here is I'm trying to break up this large group of trees into smaller segments or smaller shapes, because I'm trying to make some suggestions of shadow areas in between the trees, so that I could suggest to the viewers that there are multiple trees there. Another thing that I'm doing here is adding a touch of Prussian blue to those shadow areas to add more of a bluish component to it, or to them. And now I'm just adding some random small marks to work on the texture of the foliage a little bit and make the canopies look more realistic. I often add a lot of these small marks, but sometimes I also just drag my pencil hoping that it will produce some random textures. Now here I have a large shadow area at the bottom, but now I'm adding some lighter marks in that shadow area to break up that dark shape, to make it more interesting and to make it look like there are some bushes and some branches and some foliage that are sticking out of that shadow area. And that makes everything look more three-dimensional and gives it a lot more depth. So with just a few suggestions of those lighter shapes, you can come up with something that really looks like realistic looking foliage. Time to finish the rest of the trees here. I'm still working with a black colored pencil, and in addition to the Faber Castell Polychromos black colored pencil, I also like to use the silky black, Kohinoor silky black pencil, because it's a bit darker and it's a bit easier for me to layer it on top of lighter colors when I want really dark colors and when I want to increase the range of value. You could get away with using just the Faber Castell Polychromos black colored pencil, but I feel this helps a little bit. So I'm trying to connect some of these shadow areas here because some of these trees are casting a shadow onto the part of the riverbank. But to this part of the riverbank here I added some brownish tones like some raw umber and a little bit of walnut brown. And then for some lighter details I added a bit of cinnamon colored pencil. And I'm also going to need some warm grey for some of the lighter rocks on that riverbank, and some greenish colors because there's always going to be a little bit of grass here and there. So as I'm refining this, it's starting to look like a rough terrain of the riverbank, and here I'm back to refining the appearance of the trees and the bushes to the right. Adding some small marks with a light green pencil just to increase that range of value, to make some random small clusters of leaves which are sticking out, catching some light from the light source. And that really makes these shapes a lot more interesting and a lot more convincing. So when it's done like this, it looks very, very complex. But the thing is that when you just stick to some of the basics, like the light source, and you stay consistent with it, you'll be able to come up with something that looks very real to the viewer. Now here, time to do a little bit more work on the water here. Like I said, I'm going to work around this swan. And the reason why I wanted to work around the shape of the swan is because the lighter parts of the swan, the parts of the swan's body which are catching light, are going to be very, very bright. They're going to be snow white almost. And in order to keep the white white, I wanted to reserve the space to be able to put the white pencil first. Because if I put it on top of some other darker layers, it may not end up being quite as bright as I intended it to be. So just to make sure that it's very, very bright, I left some space for the white pencil, and that's going to ensure that I get a lot of contrast. Now I'm drawing a lot of these small, slightly darker marks using a Prussian blue colored pencil, which is a little bit darker. So I want to create some darker ripples in the water. Like I said, I want to create a suggestion of the movement of the water, and I'm drawing those darker ripples, and then I'm going to draw some lighter ripples on top of that. But notice how my marks are wider and larger here in the foreground, and how much smaller they are, almost like very short marks or very short dots as you look further away in the distance. So by using the size of the ripples, I can suggest to the viewer that they are looking at the distance, that I can create that feeling of depth just by varying the size of the ripples. So now I'm adding some details to the foreground area and some cool grayish tones in addition to the light blue tones. And now it's time to put in some details on this swan here. It's going to have a light side and the shadow side. The light side is the upper side because it's catching light from above, but also there's more light coming from the right side and there's more shadow on the left side because the light source is more on the right. So I'm going to stay consistent with that, and I made the swan's neck a bit darker on the left side and lighter on the right. Of course, the swan itself is going to have its reflection, but reflection is going to be kind of distorted because of the ripples in the water. So I don't really have to worry about the exact shape of the reflection. I can just wiggle my hand a little bit to create something that kind of matches the image above the water. The swan itself took a little bit of fidgeting and a few adjustments because it's a very small detail, and I needed to resharpen my pencils and check my reference a number of times just to see if I got the shape to look right. So once I was sure about the shape and I established the contrast between the light side and the shadow side on the swan's body, I refined the reflection a little bit, and then I was ready to move on to the rest of the riverbank and the rest of the water. The reason why this detail, the swan, looks so good now is because of the contrast. It's the lightest thing in the scene, and it really stands out against the surface of the water, which, like I said, I deliberately made it a bit darker than the sky. And it also stands out nicely against everything else. Here I'm shading the shadow side of the riverbank, adding those shadow areas on the rocks here at the bottom and on the left side, all of those surfaces which are facing away from the light source. After that, I'm putting in some lighter marks to suggest those lighter areas or lighter rocks which are catching light from the light source, and that's creating a very nice contrast between the light side and the shadow side of those parts of the riverbank. To the shadow side, I also added some more of the Prussian blue because I want this part of the riverbank to be in the shade and to have a bit more of a bluish component. Here I also added some suggestions of grass and bushes in between those rocks just to make the terrain a bit more interesting, and added a little bit more of that Prussian blue, a little bit more of the black to increase the range of value and to increase the contrast between those light details and the shadow areas. Now I'm going to do the reflection of those trees on the right side of the water. So this right side of the water is going to appear more greenish than bluish, but it's also going to be distorted a little bit. The reflection is also going to be distorted by the ripples in the water. So what I need to do here is I need to try to match the image above the water in terms of the value. So where I have those slightly darker values, I'm going to have slightly darker colors. But of course it's not going to be the same because there are many other things here. I also want to add some shadows here, random shadows here and there. And I want to add some of these lighter ripples here because the overall color is a bit warmer. I'm going to use a warmer color for the ripples. I'm using a warm gray, and again I'm making the ripples which are further away a bit smaller and the ones which are closer to us, a bit wider. Now I'm going to break up that surface with a bit of blue colored pencil and add a few of those bluish ripples to this greenish area, just to disrupt the shape or to disrupt that shape of the reflection with some bluish ripples which suggest the movement of the water. And then I added some lighter ripples to try to match the lighter details above the water. And I'm just putting down some finishing touches here to some of these rocks, but my scene is mostly done. So it's a nice little scene, something that you would see on the Danube perhaps. My town where I live is located on the Danube, and it has a very nice riverbank, and you can often see swans there. Anyway, I think I'm mostly done with this drawing. I want to remind you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and also to check out my other videos. If you want to see a lot more content and longer videos, full-length narrated videos, you should check out my Patreon. Now I'm just going to put my signature here in the lower left corner. And that's it. The drawing is now done. I hope you liked it. And of course, I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.